before you judge the power of a small act, listen carefully to this story. The coastal town of Greyhaven was a quiet place where life moved gently with the rhythm of the sea. Small wooden houses, painted in faded shades of blue and white, lined the narrow streets near the shore. Fishing boats rocked softly in the harbor, while seagulls circled lazily above the calm water. Every evening, the salty breeze carried the smell of the ocean through the village. Fishermen returned home with their catches, villagers walked slowly through the harbor, and warm lanterns began glowing in the windows as the sun dipped below the horizon. From the cliffs overlooking the town stood an old stone lighthouse, watching silently over the sea. But on this particular evening, the peaceful sky began to change. Far out on the horizon, dark clouds slowly gathered, spreading across the sky like a heavy curtain. The golden colors of sunset faded as shadows swallowed the light. The once calm ocean began to grow restless beneath the approaching storm. Winds swept across the cliffs, bending tall grass and rattling wooden shutters throughout the village. Fishermen looked toward the horizon with concern as the waves grew darker and stronger. The villagers quickly began preparing. Boats were secured tightly to the docks, market stalls closed, and families hurried indoors as thunder rolled across the sky. Lightning flashed across the distant ocean. The storm had arrived. High above the crashing waves stood the lighthouse, its tall stone tower standing firm against the powerful wind and rain. For years, that lighthouse had guided ships safely through the dangerous coastline. But tonight, something was different. Not far from the cliffs, in a small farmhouse surrounded by fields, lived a farmer named Edward and his young son Lucas. Edward was a hardworking man with a calm and thoughtful nature. Lucas, curious and energetic, loved watching the ocean and the tall lighthouse that stood along the cliffs. That evening, as dark clouds rolled across the sky, Lucas pointed toward the lighthouse in the distance. Something felt wrong. The tower stood silent and dark. Inside the farmhouse, warm lantern light filled the small room while rain began tapping against the windows. Lucas stood near the glass, staring toward the cliffs. The lighthouse still had no light. Edward noticed it too. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he quietly took his coat and picked up a lantern. Lucas looked at his father with surprise. Without saying much, Edward opened the door as powerful wind and rain rushed inside. Lucas followed closely behind. If no one else was going to light the lighthouse, they would. The storm had grown fierce as they stepped into the open fields. Rain poured from the sky while strong wind pushed against them. Edward held the lantern carefully while Lucas struggled to keep up beside him. Far ahead, the tall lighthouse stood dark against the violent sky. Together, they walked through the storm. They reached the narrow cliffside path leading up toward the tower. Below them, enormous waves crashed violently against the rocks, while lightning lit the sky in sudden flashes. Step by step, father and son climbed higher toward the lighthouse. Finally, they reached the heavy wooden door at the base of the tower. Edward pushed it open. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and silent. Dust covered the stone walls, and a spiral staircase twisted upward into the shadows above. Holding the lantern, Edward and Lucas began climbing. Round and round the narrow staircase they went, the storm echoing through the tower walls, while flashes of lightning appeared through the small windows. Halfway up, Lucas paused to catch his breath, but Edward smiled reassuringly. They kept climbing. At last, they reached the lantern room at the top of the tower. Large glass windows revealed the raging ocean far below. The great lighthouse lamp sat silent in the center of the room. Edward began working quickly. He cleaned the thick glass panels while the storm roared outside. Lucas watched quietly as his father carefully prepared the old mechanism. Then, Edward lit the flame. Slowly, the lantern came to life. A warm golden glow filled the room, pushing back the darkness around them. Edward opened the heavy shutters. Instantly, a powerful beam of light burst across the stormy ocean, cutting through the rain and darkness like a glowing path. Far out at sea, a small fishing boat struggled against the violent waves. The storm had caught the sailors by surprise. Rain poured across the deck while the captain fought to keep the boat steady against the crashing water. They could barely see anything through the storm. The coastline had disappeared. Then suddenly, one sailor shouted. Through the heavy rain, a faint golden light appeared in the distance. At first, it looked like a tiny flicker, but slowly it grew brighter. "The lighthouse!" the captain shouted. Relief spread across the crew. They turned the boat toward the distant beam, carefully guiding the vessel through the dangerous rocks and toward the safe harbor. Back in the lighthouse tower, Lucas stood beside his father, watching the beam stretch across the ocean. Somewhere out in the storm, that single light was guiding people home. Edward quietly looked out across the sea. He did not know who the light would help, and he did not need to. What mattered was that the light was shining. As the night passed, the storm slowly began to weaken. The rain softened and the clouds began drifting apart. Far below, the fishing boat safely approached the harbor, guided by the lighthouse beam. Inside the tower, Lucas looked at his father with admiration. Edward gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember this," he said softly. "No act of kindness is ever too small when someone out there is lost in the dark." Later that night, father and son walked back down the cliff path toward their farmhouse while the lighthouse continued shining behind them. The storm had passed. Moonlight reflected peacefully across the ocean, and high above the cliffs, the lantern still glowed, guiding anyone who needed its light.